I woke up to the smell of burnt butter and smoke curling under my bedroom door, and for one confused second I thought something in my own apartment was on fire. I grabbed the shirt off the floor and walked into my kitchen half asleep, and there she was, Simone Ashford, my boss, standing at my stove in my gray t-shirt, hair a mess, holding a spatula like it might bite her. She turned around, saw me standing there, and said the last thing I expected to hear that morning. "Thank you for last night." I did not know whether to laugh or panic. "My name is Weston Marsh. I am 39 years old, and for the last 6 years I have run building operations for Ashford Tower in Atlanta, Georgia, a glass building downtown that houses about 400 people who have never once had to think about where their electricity comes from, or why their elevators run on time, or why the water pressure never drops on the 9th floor even in August. That is my job. Keeping the invisible things working so nobody has to notice them. Before that, I spent 8 years in the Navy as an electrician's mate, learning wiring diagrams in the belly of a ship where a mistake could cost more than money. Before that, I was a kid in East Point who fixed his neighbor's window units for $10 a job because I liked knowing exactly why something had stopped working and exactly how to make it start again. I like machines because they tell you the truth. A generator does not lie to you. A circuit breaker does not pretend to be fine when it is not fine. If something is broken, it shows you where, plainly, without excuses. People, I have found, are a different story entirely. I got divorced 3 years ago. Her name was Yolanda, and we did not have children together, which people always seem surprised by. Like a marriage needs proof to have mattered. It mattered. It just did not last. The last real conversation we ever had, standing in a kitchen that used to be ours, she told me I never wanted more than the life I already had, and she said it like an accusation, not an observation. Maybe she was right. I have never needed much. A quiet apartment, a toolbox I keep organized better than most people keep their finances, a watch that used to belong to my father, its crystal cracked down the middle from the day he dropped it fixing a transformer in 1989, still ticking because I refit the movement myself 2 winters ago in the building's electrical room, alone, after hours, the way I do most things that matter to me. I live by routine, because routine is the one thing in my life that has never once let me down. I am up before 6 every morning, and I walk the building before the day shift arrives. Checking panels, checking pressure gauges, checking the small things that turn into big things if you let them go unnoticed long enough. That is how I first noticed her. Simone Ashford, chief executive of Ashford Capital Group, granddaughter of the man whose name is carved into the lobby wall in 6-inch brass letters. She was always on the rooftop terrace at 6 in the morning, alone, coffee in hand, looking out over the city like she was waiting for it to say something back to her. She never came up there to be seen. There was no assistant trailing behind her, no phone glowing in her hand, just her and the skyline, and whatever weight she was carrying that she never brought back downstairs with her. People talked about her the way people always talk about anyone with money and a famous last name. That she was cold, that she had ice running through her instead of blood. I never believed a word of it, not because I knew her personally, but because I noticed things nobody else in that building ever bothered to notice. She remembered the name of the woman who ran the parking garage booth. She held the elevator doors open for the mail cart every single morning without ever being asked to. She never smiled for the cameras when the business magazines came through the lobby, but she smiled, quietly, honestly, for the janitor on the 4th floor, a man named Otis, who had worked in that building longer than she had been alive. I kept my distance the way I keep my distance from most things that could complicate a life I had already rebuilt once from nothing. I was not looking for anything. I told myself that so often it almost worked. But there is a difference between not looking and not seeing, and I saw her. I saw her most mornings, and some part of me, the part I did not examine too closely, started arranging my rounds so I would pass the rooftop door around the same time she was always up there. I did not know yet that she had been doing something similar. I did not know that the woman who ran a billion-dollar company had learned my schedule before I ever thought to learn hers. The storm came through Atlanta on a Thursday in October, the kind of storm the weather stations argue about for 2 days before it arrives, and then, somehow, still underestimate anyway. By 7 in the evening, the wind was pulling at the building's exterior panels hard enough that I could hear it groaning in the stairwells. And by 8, the transformer feeding the east side of the tower took a direct hit from a falling limb 2 blocks over, and the whole building went dark except for the emergency lighting, which buys you maybe 90 minutes before it starts dying too. Everybody with sense had already gone home hours earlier. I had not, because somebody has to stay when the power goes, and that somebody was always going to be me. I made my way down to the electrical room with a flashlight clipped to my collar and started working through the transfer switch sequence to bring the backup generator online, running the checklist the way I have run it 100 times before, calm, methodical, the kind of work that does not leave room for panic, because panic is exactly what gets people electrocuted. I was maybe 20 minutes into it when my radio caught a call from building security saying there was still someone up on the 32nd floor. Executive level, a single person, alone, no response on the office line. I told them I would go myself, mostly because I did not trust anyone else to navigate that floor in total darkness without walking straight into a glass wall, and partly because some instinct I did not want to name out loud told me exactly whose office that was. I found her sitting on the floor of her own office, back pressed against the wall beneath the window, knees pulled up to her chest. The city outside dark in patches like a puzzle with half its pieces missing. She had her phone in her hand with no signal left, and a flashlight app that was dying along with everything else in the building. When my light hit her face, she flinched hard, and then she laughed. But it was not a real laugh. It was the sound someone makes when they are trying to convince their own body that they are fine. "I am fine," she said, before I even asked her anything. "I just do not love the dark. Never have. Not since I was a kid. I did not push. I have learned over the years that people tell you what they are ready to tell you, and pushing only ever closes the door faster." I told her the generator would be running within the hour, and I sat down a few feet away from her, not right next to her, because I did not want to make assumptions about what she needed from me, just close enough that she was not sitting alone in that dark anymore. She noticed the watch on my wrist and asked about it. I do not know why I told her the truth, instead of the short version I usually give people who ask. I told her about my father, about the transformer that cracked the crystal, about spending 2 winters teaching myself to refit a movement I had no business touching because I was not about to pay a stranger to fix the one thing of his I had left in this world. She listened the way almost nobody listens anymore, without reaching for her phone once, without waiting for her turn to talk. Then she told me something I did not expect at all. She told me that 3 months earlier she had almost resigned from the company her own grandfather built, that the board had been circling for over a year, waiting patiently for a reason to push her out and hand everything to someone carrying her grandfather's last name but none of her actual instincts, and that on the night she finally sat down to write her resignation letter, she could not stop thinking about the fact that nobody in that entire building would actually notice she was gone. Not really. Not the way you notice a person disappearing, only the way you notice a title changing on a door somewhere. I told her that was not true, and she asked me quietly how I would even know that. I said, because I noticed her, not the chief executive. Her, the rooftop, the coffee, the way she remembered the parking attendant's name every single morning. She went quiet for a long moment after that, quiet enough that I could hear the wind still pulling hard at the windows behind us. And when she finally spoke again, her voice had changed completely, softer, like she had decided somewhere in that silence to stop protecting something she had guarded for years. The storm outside had not let up at all, and the streets below us, whenever the lightning lit them for a second, showed standing water already climbing the curbs on the low end of the block, exactly where the parking structures dipped underground. When the generator finally kicked on and the lights flickered back to life, floor by floor, she stood up too fast and nearly lost her balance completely, and I caught her elbow without even thinking about it, and for one long second neither of us moved an inch. I walked her down to the garage myself, because the elevators were still running on limited power, and I did not trust the electrical load on the lower levels yet, not with a system that had just taken a direct hit. Her car was already half underwater, trapped in a bay that had flooded faster than anyone could have expected, and every rideshare app in the city was either dead or quoting wait times longer than the storm itself was expected to last. I live 4 blocks from the tower. I told her that, not as an offer exactly, more as a plain fact, the kind of thing you say when you are trying very hard not to make something sound like more than it actually is. She did not answer right away. She looked at the water rising steadily around her car, then back at me, and then she said okay, in a voice that told me she had already decided something more than just where she was going to sleep that night. We walked those 4 blocks in rain that had not fully let up, jackets pulled up uselessly against wind that did not care one bit about either of us, and by the time we reached my building we were both soaked straight through. I gave her a towel, and because everything she had brought with her was wet, I gave her a shirt too, the plain gray one I keep in the drawer for the gym, because it was the only clean, dry thing in that apartment that would come close to fitting her. We sat in my kitchen that night, her in my shirt, me in a dry set of clothes, drinking coffee at 11 at night because neither of us was going to fall asleep anytime soon. She told me more that night than I think she had told another living person in years, about her grandfather, about the board, about a childhood spent being taught, gently but firmly, that showing anyone what actually scared you was the same as handing them a weapon they could use against you later. I told her about Yolanda in return, about the 2 of us drifting apart so slowly that neither of us noticed until we were standing on opposite sides of something neither of us could cross back over anymore. I told her I had stopped expecting anyone to actually see me a long time ago, that I had made a kind of peace with being the man who fixes things quietly and disappears back into the walls when the work is done. She looked at me for a long moment after I said that, and then she said something I did not fully understand until much later, something about how the people who disappear into the walls are usually the exact ones holding the whole building up from the inside. I did not know what to say back to that, so I did not say anything at all. We sat there a while longer, the storm finally quieting outside the window, until she fell asleep on my couch, somewhere around 1 in the morning, and I put a blanket over her shoulders and went to bed telling myself, not very convincingly, that this had all just been about the weather. 4 days after the storm, Foster Reyes walked back into Ashford Tower like he had never really left it, which technically he had not fully, since he still sat on the board even after Simone ended their engagement 2 years earlier. Foster was vice chairman, the kind of man who had inherited a seat at that table and spent every year since trying to convince everyone around him that he had actually earned it, and he had a particular way of smiling that let you know he had already decided how a conversation was going to end before it had even started. I did not think much of it when I saw him crossing the lobby that morning, because men like Foster came and went through Ashford Tower the way weather does, loud, temporary, and mostly harmless if you stood still long enough for it to pass. What I did not know yet was that somebody on his staff, a former assistant of his who still had lingering access credentials nobody in the building had bothered to revoke, had quietly pulled 2 minutes of lobby security footage from the night of the storm. Footage I had helped install myself, cameras I had personally calibrated with my own 2 hands, now being used to build a story that had absolutely nothing to do with the truth of what actually happened. The footage showed exactly what it showed. Me and Simone leaving the building together at 11 o'clock that night, walking together into the rain. Nothing more than that, and nothing less. But nothing more than that was more than enough for a man who was already looking for a reason. Foster requested a private meeting with me 2 days later, in a glass conference room on the 34th floor that somehow felt colder than the weather had been outside. He did not offer me a seat. He stood at the window with his back to the city skyline, and let the silence stretch out between us before he finally turned around to face me. "Men like you always find a way into rooms you were never meant to be standing in," he said, like he was commenting casually on the weather, instead of insulting me directly to my face. He told me he had already seen the footage. He told me the board would find it very interesting indeed to learn that their chief executive had spent a private evening alone with a member of the maintenance staff, especially during a week when the company was finalizing a merger vote that would decide whether Ashford Capital stayed independent or got folded quietly into a much larger firm. Foster had been courting behind Simone's back for over a year already. I understood then, standing in that cold glass room, exactly what this was actually about. It was never about me at all. I was simply the easiest weapon he happened to find lying around, close enough to reach for. I told him the truth, plainly, the same way I tell the truth about most things in my life. I said nothing happened that night except two people sitting in a dark office waiting for the lights to come back on. And if he wanted to twist that into some kind of scandal, that said far more about the kind of man he was than it would ever say about her. He smiled, the way people smile when they believe they have already won an argument nobody else in the room is even having with them. He told me I should consider very carefully how a story like this would look for someone in my particular position, said it with a softness that somehow made the threat land even harder than if he had simply shouted it at me. Men who fix elevators for a living tend to find themselves unemployed rather quickly once the wrong people decide they have become inconvenient, he said, and then he walked out of that room like he had already filed the outcome away as settled business. I did not tell Simone right away. I told myself I was protecting her from the noise, but if I am honest with myself, some part of me was scared that once she understood the position I had accidentally put her in, without ever meaning to, she would decide the safest thing to do was put real distance between us, and I did not know how I would prepare myself for that particular loss. I did not have to wait long to find out one way or the other. Foster brought the footage to an emergency board session 2 days later, framing it exactly the way I had expected him to, questioning her judgment, questioning her focus during a critical merger week, dressing up an old personal grudge as a serious governance concern for the shareholders. I was not in that room myself. I heard about it afterward from Otis, who heard it from a floor assistant, the way everything eventually moves through a building no matter how many glass walls try their best to contain it. I spent that entire afternoon down in the electrical room, pretending to inspect panels I had already inspected twice that same week, because standing still with my hands empty felt worse than doing work that did not need doing. Every few minutes I checked my phone for a message that never came, and I told myself that meant nothing, that a woman running a company through a crisis did not owe anyone updates, least of all a man who worked 3 floors below her in every sense that mattered on paper. But some part of me kept circling back to Foster's words in that cold glass room, turning them over and over the way you turn over a wire you cannot figure out how to reconnect safely. What I did not expect was Simone standing up in that very room and answering him directly, in front of every single board member who had ever quietly doubted whether she truly belonged in her own grandfather's chair. She told them the footage showed exactly what it showed. 2 employees leaving a building safely together during a genuinely dangerous storm, and that if the board wanted to spend the merger vote discussing her personal life, instead of the actual numbers sitting in front of them, that told her everything she needed to know about who really deserved a seat at that table going forward. She did not raise her voice a single time. She did not need to. She looked directly at Foster the entire time she spoke, steady, unshaken, and by the time she finished, 3 board members who had been quietly leaning toward his position were no longer looking at him at all. She won that room, decisively, and without raising her voice once, but she paid a real price for it. Everyone in that building now knew, or at least believed they knew, something private about her, something she had never chosen to make public on her own terms, and I was the reason why. I felt that particular weight the rest of the day like a stone sitting low in my chest, growing heavier with every passing hour, because the very last thing I ever wanted in this life was to become a liability inside the life of the one person who had actually taken the time to see me clearly. I found her that evening in the electrical room, of all the places in that entire tower, sitting on the same metal stool I use when I am rewiring a panel, looking completely out of place in a room full of conduit and breaker boxes, while wearing a tailored gray suit. She said she had been looking for somewhere in the building nobody would think to come looking for her, and somehow her feet had carried her all the way down to the one room in Ashford Tower that still smelled faintly of ozone and machine oil, the one place that reminded her most of the night everything between us had actually started. I told her I was sorry, that none of this mess would have ever touched her if I had simply kept my distance the way I always do with everyone. She shook her head before I even finished saying the sentence out loud. It was never about that night in the storm, she said. It was never really about last night, or any single night, if we are being honest with each other. It was about every night before that one, every morning on the rooftop, every time you noticed something about me that nobody else in this entire building ever bothered to notice, and you never once used it to get closer to me, or to get anything from me at all. You just kept showing up anyway, quietly, asking for nothing in return. I did not have an answer ready for that. I stood there in a room I had wired with my own 2 hands, in a building I had spent 6 years keeping alive from the inside where nobody could ever see me doing it, and the one person who had actually seen me clearly was telling me she had been watching long before I ever noticed her watching me back. She told me she remembered the first morning she noticed me noticing her, months before the storm ever came through Atlanta, a Tuesday when I had stopped my rounds just long enough to prop the rooftop door so it would not slam shut in the wind behind her. She said she had stood there afterward wondering why a man who had no reason to care whether a door slammed would bother fixing it anyway, and that the question had stayed with her longer than she wanted to admit, long after she had gone back downstairs and buried herself in spreadsheets for the rest of the day. She told me the truth about that morning after the storm too. The thing I had wondered about quietly without ever letting myself ask her directly. When she said thank you for last night, she had not just meant the ride to my apartment, or the couch, or the coffee at midnight between 2 exhausted people. She meant every single part of it. The part where I did not push her to explain her fear of the dark, the part where I sat close enough that she was not alone anymore, but far enough that she never once felt cornered into saying more than she actually wanted to say. She told me that in a life built entirely around people who wanted something from her, a name, access, a merger, an alliance, a marriage even, I had never once asked her for a single thing, and that had frightened her far more than any storm ever could. I told her about Yolanda then, more honestly than I had ever told anyone, including myself if I am being completely truthful. I told her that my ex-wife had once said I never wanted more than the life I already had, and that for 3 long years I had let that one sentence sit inside me like it was simply true, like wanting a small, quiet life somehow made me less of a man. I told her that meeting her had made me realize the actual problem was never that I wanted too little out of life. It was that I had never once let myself want anything I was afraid I could not keep hold of. She reached over and took my hand, right there in the electrical room, under fluorescent light that buzzed faintly overhead, surrounded by circuit panels and the low, steady hum of a building that never really sleeps, not fully, not ever. She asked me if I was afraid of what people would eventually say. A man like me standing next to a woman in her particular position, and I told her the only opinion I had ever built my life around was my own, and my own opinion had already quietly decided, somewhere between that rooftop and that storm, that I was not walking away from this out of fear of what anyone else might think or say behind our backs. I told her about my father's watch again, the one still ticking steadily on my wrist, because I had refused to let something broken stay broken, simply because fixing it properly took more patience than most people are willing to spend. I told her some things in this life are worth exactly that kind of patience. She looked down at the watch for a long, quiet moment, and then she looked back up at me, and I understood, without either one of us needing to say it out loud, that we had both just decided something between us that was not going to be undone by a boardroom, or an ugly rumor, or a man like Foster Reyes trying to weaponize a night that had never really belonged to him in the first place. Foster lost his seat on the board 6 months later, not because of anything he ever tried to do to Simone or to me directly, but because the same internal investigation that had originally surfaced the security footage eventually surfaced something far more damaging underneath it, a pattern of quiet, private meetings with the very outside firm he had been secretly pushing Ashford Capital to merge with, meetings that had been happening long before he ever brought a single honest concern to the board about anything at all. The merger he wanted so badly collapsed under the weight of its own dishonesty, and he resigned quietly before the board could vote him out themselves, which in that particular building is about as close to real justice as anyone ever actually gets. Simone and I did not announce anything to anyone in that building, and honestly, we did not need to. We simply started showing up in the same places, at the same times, the way 2 people naturally do once something has settled between them that no longer requires any explaining. She started taking the stairs down to the electrical room some evenings instead of calling the elevator, just to sit and talk for a while after a long day. And I stopped pretending, even to myself, that my morning rounds did not always somehow end up near the rooftop door right around 6 o'clock. There was no single moment where it became official, no conversation where either of us announced what we were to each other, and I think that was exactly the point. 1 month it was coffee on the roof, that lasted 10 minutes longer than it needed to. 2 months later, it was dinner at a small place near my apartment that she picked because nobody from the office would ever think to look for her there. By the 4th month, Otis had started leaving the elevator on the ground floor a little longer than usual whenever he saw us walking in together, never saying a word about it, just quietly making room for something he understood, without needing it explained to him. I remember one evening in early spring when she showed up at the electrical room still in her work clothes, exhausted from a day of contract negotiations that had run long, and instead of talking about the merger or the board or any of it, she just sat on that same metal stool and asked me to explain how a transfer switch worked, start to finish, the way I would explain it to anyone learning the trade. I walked her through it slowly, and she listened the same way she always listened, fully, without her phone in her hand, and by the end of it she said she finally understood why I found this kind of work peaceful. "Everything here either works or it does not," she said. "There is no room for people to lie to you about it." I taught her how to properly wind a mechanical watch one quiet Sunday afternoon in my apartment, the exact same patient way my father had once taught me. Slow, careful, mindful, never to overwind the delicate spring inside. She got it wrong the first 4 times in a row and laughed every single time she did. A real laugh. Warm and unguarded, nothing at all like the hollow one I had first heard from her in that dark office the night of the storm. I gave her my father's watch as a gift on the 6-month anniversary of that storm, not as some grand gesture or a planned speech, just handed it across my own kitchen table, one ordinary evening the same casual way I would hand her a fresh cup of coffee, because some things in this life do not need ceremony to mean absolutely everything to the people involved. She wore that watch every single day after that, even into board meetings, even onto shareholder calls. This small, cracked crystal watch worth nothing at all to anyone else in the world but the two of us, sitting quietly on the wrist of a woman who ran a company worth more money than either of us could really picture in our heads. Nobody at Ashford Capital ever thought to ask her about it directly. I think most of them simply assumed it was some old family heirloom passed down the proper way. Otis knew better, of course. Otis always seemed to know better than anyone about everything that ever happened inside that building. We never once sat down and talked about titles, or headlines, or what people 3 floors above that electrical room might privately think about a maintenance supervisor and a chief executive quietly building a life together, one unremarkable dinner at a time. We built what we had the exact same way I build everything else in my life. Slowly, deliberately, checking each connection carefully before ever moving on to the next one, trusting that something wired correctly the first time around rarely needs fixing again later. By the 10th month, she had started keeping a second toothbrush at my apartment without either of us discussing it out loud. The same quiet way, she had started leaving her laptop bag by my door on the nights she knew she would not be going home. I never asked her to. She never announced it. It simply happened the way most true things in my life have happened, gradually, without ceremony, until one day I looked around my apartment and realized it had somehow become ours without either of us signing anything or saying a single word about it. Yolanda reached out once during that stretch. A short message asking how I was doing, the kind people send when they have heard secondhand that your life has changed, and they are curious whether the change suits you. I told her the truth, that I was doing well, better than I had in years, and I did not feel the need to explain any further than that. Some doors close all the way, and you do not have to slam them to know they are shut for good. Otis retired that same year, after 31 years of running the 4th floor better than any manager ever had on paper, and at his small send-off in the lobby, Simone stood up in front of the whole building and told everyone, plainly, that some of the most important people in a company are never the ones whose names end up on the walls. She looked at me once while she said it, just once, quick enough that almost nobody else in the room noticed, but I noticed, the way I have always noticed the things about her that mattered most. Some mornings she still meets me up on that rooftop before the sun has even fully risen, coffee in hand just like always, and some mornings I still find quiet reasons to walk past that same door at exactly 6 o'clock, not because I actually have anything left to check up there anymore, but because some routines I have learned are simply worth keeping even long after the original reason for starting them has already been fully answered. People still ask me sometimes what she truly meant that first morning, standing in my kitchen wearing my shirt, telling me thank you for last night before I even understood what had actually happened between the two of us. For a long time, I honestly thought it was about the storm, about the ride home, about a stranger simply being kind to her on the worst night of a genuinely difficult year. Now I know it was really about every night before that one too. Every single morning, she stood alone on that rooftop, quietly hoping somebody would finally notice her the exact way I already had, without her ever having to ask. Some people spend their entire lives waiting patiently for someone to finally see them clearly. I spent mine quietly showing up instead, fixing whatever needed fixing, asking for absolutely nothing in return until the right person finally noticed that the man living quietly inside the walls was actually worth stepping outside to come find. I still wear a plain gray t-shirt some mornings just because it makes her smile, and I still find, most days, that the smallest routines end up carrying the most weight of all. If a story like this one ever moved you, even just a little bit, tonight, I would ask you to sit quietly with two honest questions before you go. Do you believe love built this slowly, this quietly, actually lasts longer in the end than the kind that starts loud, with fireworks and grand declarations? And if you had been standing in Simone's position that day, would you have had the courage to stand up in that boardroom the exact way she did, in front of every single person who had ever doubted you belonged there? If this story reached you tonight, hit like, subscribe for more stories exactly like this one, and leave a comment telling me honestly what those two simple words, last night, would have meant to you.